As I started last week, I want to start again now with words of eulogy. Even as Shiva is over, I still feel an enormous sadness from Rabbi Lamm's passing. The simple fact is that from the early 1960s until the late 2000s, the modern Orthodox community that I was living in could very well have been called, and I have no doubt will be called by the historians, the era of Rabbi Lamm. Everybody was responding to ideas that Rabbi Lamm was putting forward and institutions that Rabbi Lamm was building. And we're not going to spend our time in these classes at all discussing what a monumental leader Rabbi Lamm was, what an important religious figure Rabbi Lamm was. We're going to spend our time in these 10 classes discussing Rabbi Lamm's scholarship. But sometimes when you talk about one aspect of a person, the listener thinks that, oh, that's who the person is. And that itself would be a tragedy here. Rabbi Lamm was 5 things, I think. At least 5 things. He was an excellent scholar, and we're going to spend 10 classes on his scholarship, and this is class number 2. He was a religious leader who articulated a vision for how a significant segment of the traditional Jewish community should view the faith and the religion, not in a scholarly way, but in a religious way. He was a Mora Hora in the sense of a person who established the path we should tread on. Even for technical halachic people like me who tend to be very caught up in very technical shilas, I very well understood that the grander questions were not answered by the technical halachicists like me, but were answered by the religious leaders like Rabbi Lamm. Rabbi Lamm was a communal leader who was a founder of many institutions that are fundamental to our community. Unlike many scholars, he not only did and wrote, he built, from YU to tradition to Morashah to countless other institutions. Rabbi Lamm built community around him. Finally, and this is something I'll touch on in the last of our 10 classes, Rabbi Lamm had a unique intellectual approach to complex issues, maybe not unique totally, but rare in our time. Rabbi Lamm deeply believed in being an intellectual diplomat who brought competing schools of thought together in a practical way. He was sometimes critiqued as a compromiser, but this was the best of the compromises. Rabbi Lamm recognized both on an intellectual and on a practical level that the best answers to hard questions weren't ones that determined which of the classical answers was right and which of the classical answers was wrong. But instead, it was an approach that synthesized the best of the various answers together in one reasonable way. And of course, Rabbi Lamm was a nice man and a good person and a wonderful father and husband. I told you a story last week about Rabbi Lamm and Mrs. Lamm that he told me, but Rabbi Lamm had a reputation for being a very kind, nice person on many levels. Not all of our rabbinic giants have a reputation for being nice people. If Rabbi Lamm had been a fantastic scholar and a great communal leader and a wonderful religious figure and a person who shouted at people, he wouldn't be the only such person. But he was a nice man and a good person and a good father and a good husband and a nice person and somebody you could readily chat with and discuss life's problems with, unaware of his greatness. That's itself sort of an important virtue. Some Gedolim are not nice people. Rabbi Lamm was a nice person. and fun to chat with. When I visited him later in life, and there was always help around the house, he was unfailingly gracious to me visiting, but also to the help around him. Rabbi Lamm was just a nice man. I note Shalom Lamm has logged on, one of Rabbi Lamm's children, and his children are an attestation to how good a person he himself was. But I confess, that's not what I want to focus on now. All of this is true, but I want to focus in class number 2 and on the remaining 10 classes, on the remaining 9 classes, this one and 8 more, on Rabbi Lamm's scholarship, because sometimes when you listen to the eulogies, you would assume Rabbi Lamm was a fundraiser or a communal leader or a nice guy or a quipster, all of which is somewhat true. But to me, Rabbi Lamm's greatness, what they'll be reading about from Rabbi Lamm in 200 and 500 years, isn't his wonderful puns or even the magnificent buildings he assisted building Yeshiva University. And when the Jewish Center in Manhattan is long gone, because it will be at some point, Rabbi Lamm's scholarship is part of the Jewish tradition. And there are no Jews in Egypt left, and yet there is a Maimonides who lived in Egypt, who we study every day. There'll be a time in the future where maybe, God forbid, there's no Jews left in Manhattan. But Rabbi Lamm produced scholarship that will survive us all in profound and important ways. He made wonderful, important contributions to the world of Torah and to the community of scholarship. Scholarship survives you in ways that stories about how good a person you are last a generation or 2, but your scholarship sometimes lasts 500 years. I spent my morning today thinking about a group of Rishonim who have been dead for 800 or 900 years. Sometimes we make landmark contributions that survive us even when people don't know anything about our personality or the great institutions that we built. Rabbi Lamm, I think, is such a person. He made landmark important stellar contributions. As I spoke last week, his work on confessions left a lasting impact on American law and is widely discussed in halacha. His book on Chassidut, which we'll discuss in another class, remains a very important contribution. His book on Rav Chaim Volozhin, the exact opposite of Chassidut, also made an important contribution. His book on Hilchot Nida is very important. His groundbreaking analysis of faith and doubt was and remains an important contribution. His discussion of Satmar Hasidism remains to this day the standard work people go to understand how that community functions. But today I want to discuss Rabbi Lamm's early and important contribution to ecology in Jewish law and theology. It was written, as far as I can tell, in 1970 and published in an obscure work called Hador, which some of us might have read, but it was widely republished and redistributed and has become the go-to standalone piece to understand the Jewish view of ecology. The number of times in which Rabbi Lamm wrote both the first and the most important piece on a topic is itself a tribute. Many years ago, I wrote an article on cloning, and it was the first piece to come out. And one of my rebbeim turned to me sweetly and said something witty. He said, Michael, in most scholarly fields, you can either be right or first. And it's very good that you're first because the piece isn't right. And I laughed and he laughed, but I know what he meant. Rabbi Lamm had a tendency to write things that were first and right and set the tone of the field. And his article on ecology and Jewish law and theology is a classic example of this. And let me start by making a methodological point about Rabbi Lamm that's worth remembering. Rabbi Lamm occasionally in quite a few of his articles, actually uses the word Jewish law and theology. And it's worth noting that Rabbi Lamm uses the word theology as a complement to halacha and not as a contrast to halacha. The academics like to joke that the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam's philosophical guide, was written by a different person than the Mishnah Torah. The Moreh Nevuchim was written, they say, by some professor at the University of Cairo named Maimonides, and the Mishnah Torah was written by some rabbi named Rambam, because there are so many points of tension between them where you wouldn't know they were written by the same person. And this is true not only for the Mishnah Torah, this is true, by the way, if you compare and contrast Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch Harav. You wouldn't know that the Shulchan Aruch Harav was written by the same person who wrote the Tanya, not Rabbi Lamm. Rabbi Lamm is incessant and committed, and he shows throughout a few different articles the unity of theology and halacha, and the idea that theology is the term used in the Jewish tradition to explain the ultimate purpose of the halachic rules. Rabbi Lamm is happy to concede that sometimes law is more inclusive than theology or less inclusive than theology, exactly because law is in the business of drawing bright lines for people to follow. So sometimes philosophy says, we need a fence that reasonable people can't climb over, and law says 5 feet. And law has a tendency to turn philosophy into an exact measure because that's the way law works and that's the way philosophy works. But Rabbi Lamm is insistent. I'm now aware in 6 different places, but if you told me that there were 15 more, I could believe that the philosophy and the halacha are essentially complementary, and that the theology, when Rabbi Lamm uses the term, is intended to be complementary to the halacha, and the halacha is intended to be complementary to the theology. Rabbi Lamm saw no tension between philosophy and halacha other than at the margins, which is law makes exact rules and philosophy makes inexact rules. So of course there's naturally a tension between a precise speed limit and the idea of driving safely, but they're not in profound tension the way you sometimes find things in the Moreh Nevuchim to be at profound tension with the Mishnah Torah, or even the Shulchan Aruch Harav at profound tension with the Tanya, or even in a few places the Chazon Ish's Amunu Bitachon with the notes of the Chazon Ish on the Shulchan Aruch. Not Rabbi Lamm. When Rabbi Lamm wants to talk to you about ecology in Jewish law and theology, he's not discussing ecology in Jewish law and ecology in Jewish theology. He perceives Jewish law and theology to be complementary siblings as they examine the theology of the Jewish, as they examine the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Lamm believes very strongly in the unity of theology and halacha within the Jewish tradition. And Rabbi Lamm is seeking to demonstrate here something very important. There is a basic idea of ecology in the Jewish tradition, but it's not at all identical to the way ecology is understood in Rachel Carlson's The Silent Spring. And Rabbi Lamm wants to demonstrate a native Jewish halacha and theology of ecology. He's not a Me Tooist. He doesn't always see an exact echo of the secular tradition in Jewish values. He notes that the Jewish tradition has a distinct notion of ecology, and Rabbi Lamm's basic approach goes as follows. When God gives people something, that God created, God's intent is not to give it to people as a form of ownership that allows destruction, but as a form of stewardship that allows use and management, but not destruction. This is Rabbi Lamm's theme of ecology, which is the earth was given to us by God, but it wasn't given to us the way property is given to us to be destroyed. When I build a car, and then I decide what I would enjoy doing is burning it to the ground, I'm allowed to do that. But when God gives us something, God gives us this something with the understanding that we are the stewards of it, and we are not the full and complete owners of it. Our mission is to manage and not destroy. As I mentioned to you last week, Rabbi Lamm uses this idea as well to explain why I can't confess to a crime, and he uses it in another time to explain why I can't commit suicide, and he uses it a few other times as well. Rabbi Lamm has a very basic, interesting contribution. He says as follows: the world is made up of two different kinds of things. Some things God gives us, and some things we create on our own. The things that God gives us, our life, nature, the ecology, these are not really ours. These are things that God gives to us in a form of stewardship for us to use and manage, but not to haphazardly destroy, even if that destruction makes us happy. This is a great idea that Rabbi Lamm has substantially contributed to the Jewish vocabulary. It's the idea of two kinds of ownership. It's the ownership of our own creation, and it's the ownership of God's material that God has given to us. We are not full owners of the world. We are mere stewards, guardians of the universe that God has created for. Rabbi Lamm advances 7 ideas in his explanation of Jewish ecology, and these 7 ideas form in the totality Rabbi Lamm's understanding of the role of Jewish ecology in many very valuable and worthwhile ways. The first idea, Rabbi Lamm says, is that the earth was created by God. There was an order of creation. The order of creation is an indication of who are the stewards and who are the wards. That man was created, people, I don't mean man here in the sense of men as opposed to women, people were created by God last in order to indicate that they are the final product of creation, and they were put on this earth in order to build and watch and ensure the viability of God's creatures. This is a very important idea. We were not either put in the Garden of Eden or taken from the Garden of Eden to destroy God's creation, but we were put in the Garden of Eden, and we were removed from the Garden of Eden and placed in the world as a whole in order to allow us to watch God's creatures and to build on God's creation. In this model, Shabbat serves as a basic reminder, Rabbi Lamm points out, of the idea that we sometimes have to stop creation in order to acknowledge that there's a creator ahead of us. If we're not careful, we might come to think that we are the creators because we've been running this world for such a long time. And the basic purpose of Shabbat is to prevent us one day a week from doing creative work. It's very interesting. I will elaborate on this in my own name, but Rabbi Lamm hints at this in the article in one of the footnotes. Commerce, which to many of us is the central thing prohibited on Shabbat. We close our stores, we don't deal with money, and we don't do business, is a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbat. It's not really centrally prohibited. The rabbis prohibited commerce. God did not. God prohibited creative work. And Rabbi Lamm intuits as follows. Really, commerce is human to human, and it's not a central aspect of creation. It's the kind of creation that humans uniquely did without God. The kind of creation that God absolutely wants us to stop is the kind of creation that imitates God's activity on earth, which is the creation of malachot, of the 39 prohibited malachot, but more generally, creative work. Making shoes is a Torah prohibition on Shabbat. Selling shoes is a rabbinic prohibition, lest I make shoes. And Rabbi Lamm's point is that making shoes most closely is what mimics what God did. God didn't sell us the shoes, God made us the shoes. And the order of creation and Shabbat serves as a basic central purpose to remind us that we were put on this earth as stewards to watch it and to emulate God as a creative force, watching the things that God created for their betterment. And then Rabbi Lamm stops to focus, I think very well, on the three different sides of the prohibition against destruction, Baal Tashchit. He divides them into three categories. I'll call them A, B, and C. He's much more creative than I am. Baal Tashchit A is wanton destruction. Baal Tashchit B is needed destruction. And Baal Tashchit C is that destruction which creates communal gain. Rabbi Lamm notes that the central prohibition of Baal Tashchit, of destruction, is random wanton destruction. God prohibits us from going around on this earth uprooting trees for no reason. God prohibits us from killing God's creatures for no reason. God prohibits us, elsewhere Rabbi Lamm says this in a much stronger way, from cutting off our arm because we want to. Wanton destruction is a nullification of the idea that we are guardians and stewards, and it is instead the argument that we are owners. Rabbi Lamm's point here is very important. If I own something, I can destroy it. If I'm a guardian of something, I'm not allowed to destroy it. Wanton destruction is the central prohibition upon which a steward is prohibited. So Rabbi Lamm posits that Baal Tashchit centrally is designed to remind us of the fact that wanton destruction is categorically and directly prohibited. We are not allowed to destroy other than, well, we'll discuss when we're allowed to destroy, but wanton destruction is always prohibited. When I come home and say I had an aggravated day at work, so I want to chop branches off the tree, that is prohibited. And let me add something that Rabbi Lamm says elsewhere and hints at here. Tsar Balei Chayim is a form of wanton destruction. I have a bad day at work and say, you know, it's very frustrating and I need to vent my frustrations by killing the cat. That's Tsar Balei Chayim and prohibited. And if I say I'm going to vent my feelings by pulling the cat's tail, that's even more prohibited That's Tsar Balei Chaim. The Jewish tradition prohibits that because it is wanton.
Michael, can you hear Michael?
Yes.
It's Elliot. Would he prefer being vegetarian over killing animals and eating meat when it's not absolutely necessary?
Gives no indication that he felt that way. No, let's come to the next category. Wanton, the second category is needed destruction. Rabbi Lamm intuits from the halacha. He doesn't intuit from his imagination. He intuits from the sources that the exact opposite of Baal Tashchit is needed destruction. We are stewards on this earth, and sometimes as stewards on this earth, you know what we need to do?
Sure.
Build a tunnel through the mountain to get to the other side. Sometimes as owners of this universe, we come to the conclusion that we need to kill the rats because they're spreading bubonic plague. Sometimes we intuit that even though mosquitoes were created by God, we need to get rid of the mosquitoes because they're spreading malaria. Needed destruction is not prohibited at all and is exactly what human beings are called for to do. As stewards, as guardians, we are authorized to walk around this world and say to ourselves, the world that God created is incomplete. You know what it needs? It needs a bridge over here. It needs a tunnel over there. This mountain needs to be leveled, and these crops need to be enhanced. We don't think that God created a perfect world and we want to live in nature. We think that God created a world for us to use for its betterment. So when you ask ourselves whether we should be in the business of improving the world, Rabbi Lamm thinks that's the central activity that the stewards do. The stewards walk around the estate that they are the stewards of, and they don't think, like the ecologists in the 1960s thought, wouldn't it be good if we could revert to the year 1320? Rabbi Lamm thought that was a horrible idea. Disease aplenty, starvation abounded. What we need progress. And ecology in the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Lamm says, is managing the universe so as to make it a better place. He's not deeply admiring of the ecologists of the 1960s and 70s who think that primitive is better. The world would be a better place if the buffalo roamed through Midtown Manhattan and the mosquitoes stung everybody and gave everybody malaria. Rabbi Lamm did not yearn to return to 1310. And by the way, he didn't yearn to return to 1910. He thought that progress was the calling card of humanity. And what we did is we took the world that God created and we made it better. If I want to reflect on an idea that Rabbi Lamm and Lord Jacobovitz was slightly older than Rabbi Lamm, but it's clear that they were friends, to pick an interesting word. They both pick up on the idea that our mission in this world is to make the world a better place. And it's not to say, oh, if God created us with mosquitoes, it's because mosquitoes are good. And if God created the world without a bridge here, we would be better if the George Washington Bridge went away. Rabbi Lamm was of the view that needed destruction was a positive force in the Jewish tradition and extremely valuable. The third kind of destruction, Baal Tashchit Si, is what Rabbi Lamm calls destruction for communal gain, which he acknowledges is more tricky and complicated, but which he recognizes is well within the role of stewards. Sometimes as a steward, you're put in a situation where you can't craft a solution in which everybody gets better. And you instead have to craft a solution in which you as a leader decide this solution is best for the largest number of people. And you engage in destruction for the benefit of most, even though this destruction might not be for the benefit of everybody. It's what the economists call non-Pareto efficient destruction. Rabbi Lamm recognizes that as stewards, we sometimes look at the ecology and say, 90% of the population gains if we do this, and 10% of the population is harmed if we do this. We have to engage in a calculus as to whether this is on the whole a communal gain. Rabbi Lamm recognizes that a steward is authorized to look at the population that they're serving and benefit the largest number of people. Sometimes we make the decision that the best thing to do is to flood this valley and create a reservoir to make sure that we are all well served with water. Now, Michael Broyde, it happens, lives in this reservoir, and not only does he live in this reservoir, but he's lived in this reservoir for a long time, and you're going to have to do something that's not good to Michael Broyde, because you're going to make him move from his homestead to someplace else. And while you might cash compensate him, it's not the same. It's just not the same. And yet we recognize that on the whole, this is good for the community, even though it might not be like eliminating the bubonic plague, which is just good for everybody. When I say, let's get rid of smallpox, nobody says, but I need smallpox. But when I say things like, let's build a reservoir over here, somebody says, but this is my homestead. And we have to say, well, this is destruction for communal gain. Rabbi Lamm recognizes that that's not prohibited. He recognizes, though, that that's much more complicated than destruction for the benefit of everybody. Rabbi Lamm then embarks on a philosophical explanation of this model of ecology, and he presents two of them, as was his style. He presents a Hasidic model and a non-Hasidic model. Many years ago, when I heard a shiur about this not from Rabbi Lamm, the person who gave the shiur said there are two models. He said there's a Hasidic model and there's a correct model. But I don't feel that way at all. There's a Hasidic model and a non-Hasidic model. The Hasidic model, Rabbi Lamm says, is predicated on the unity of people and nature, and argues in a non-pantheistic way, but nonetheless in an idea of the unity of nature, that the spectrum between the earth and its final creatures in creation is the slope function, and that we're all approximately creatures of God. Humans are the caretakers, but we're not remarkably different from other creatures that God created. And there's a unity of the whole in the creatures of God, and we are the pinnacle of this creation. But in the Hasidic model, there's something more pan-naturalistic in this model. This contrasts, Rabbi Lamm says, with Rabbi Chaim Volozhin's, which I think is the general non-Hasidic understanding, which is there's a step order function difference between the place people have in the universe and the place all other creatures have. Even though we were created on the last half of the sixth day, you shouldn't think that other things that were created on other days are close to us at all. The holiness of nature in the non-Hasidic model argues for the disunity between people, humans, and all other aspects of creation. It's a very fascinating disagreement between the Hasidic perspective and the Misnagid perspective as to whether the thrust of creation is there were 6 days of creation along a slope, and the gap between us and that's just before us is not profound or significant, or maybe it's significant but not profound. There's a slope function in the creation model, this school of thought says, and Reb Chaim Volozhin's view, which is that the creation of humans were unique and different and unparalleled in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to reflect on this in 2 directions, by the way, in my own voice, not directly in Rabbi Lamm's voice, to elaborate, though, on what Rabbi Lamm says. Since the 1970s, much halachic literature has developed, Michael Broyde would say, to show that both of these schools of thought are well vested in the Jewish tradition and that Rabbi Lamm got it right to highlight both of them. One school of thought that shows that there's a spectrum is the incessant showing by many halachic authorities that the gap between humans and monkeys is not so great in the Jewish tradition. And that there were a group of Rishonim who thought that Adnei Hasada, gorillas, in the absence of a better term, might be quasi-human beings, and Rabbi Akiva Eger is not sure if orangutans are quasi-human beings. This extends the umbrella of humanness leftward. And then, in a more interesting analysis, the ultimate chassid, the Shulchan Aruch Harav in the Tanya, argues that not only are human beings a step function different from animals, but Jews are a step function different from non-Jews as well, arguing that there's actually 2 steps in the last half of creation, the creation of a Jewish soul and the creation of a non-Jewish soul. Both of these have highlighted the fact, in my view, that Rabbi Lamm got it right to highlight that there are 2 different models of our understanding of nature, the Hasidic model and the Misnagid model. I just would footnote this by saying there are plenty of Misnagdim who are really Hasidim on this matter, and there are plenty of Hasidim who are really Misnagdim on this matter. I think, by the way, Rabbi Lamm in heaven is listening to this and smiling, because I know from conversation that he didn't think that the gap between Reb Chaim Volozhin and the Shulchan Aruch Harav was so enormous, and that the gap was not so great. And so I think that the vision of Hasidim who are Misnagdim and Misnagdim who are Hasidim very much reflected on Rabbi Lamm's sense of what the world really was. In our last class, I'll reflect on this more greatly, that Rabbi Lamm liked to create these kinds of intellectual compromises in powerful, thoughtful ways. And then finally, Rabbi Lamm brings the whole matter home by reiterating his idea that the basic perspective of Jewish ecology is that people are co-creators with God of this world. God chose to create a world in which he laid out the foundational pieces of the world in creation. And then he said to human beings, you now go create above and beyond this and take my world and make it a better place. We are charged in this model with being co-creators with God. It's the ultimate partnership between human beings and God in Rabbi Lamm's vision. The truth is that this model is very, very, very important, because Rabbi Lamm was very much worried, and he expresses it in a few different ways, in a few different pieces, with the idea that people would see themselves distant from the divine creation, or even at tension with the divine creation. And Rabbi Lamm very much believed that the secret to creating ethical human beings was to inspire people into believing that God created tools and we were co-creators with God in this perfect world. God didn't do the whole thing. God laid out basic building tools for what we needed to do, and we then were charged with carrying on that building. And that this model of our relationship with God was central and important and kept us on the morally right track. If you'll excuse me, Rabbi Lamm very much believed in what the evangelicals call, what would Jesus do? Now, of course, Rabbi Lamm didn't say, what would Jesus do? But Rabbi Lamm believed that human beings were charged with saying, what would God do? Because we were put on this earth to be God's partner in every aspect and every activity. So the ecology is God's garden that God created and handed to us. And he didn't say, do whatever you want with the garden. Not at all. God said to us, this is my garden, and you are stewards and guardians of the garden. Treat it as you think best in its best interest, given the fact that I, God, have created it. This is Rabbi Lamm's basic tool for morality, which is Rabbi Lamm thinks that people and God are partners in goodness. And there's no tension between our role as a godly person and God's role delegating to us some of God's authority. Next week, I'm going to discuss Rabbi Lamm's interest in Satmar Hasidim, mostly because Rabbi Lamm has an important portrayal of Satmar Hasidim from their own perspective, where they think, of course, they are doing God's work. And I want to relate this to the basic idea that Rabbi Lamm thinks that godly people perceive themselves as doing God's work. And even when we don't agree, and we think you're not doing God's work, we need to study and examine the people who are examining the godly literature of Torah and reaching different conclusions from our own. So we're going to meet again next week at 6 o'clock to explore Rabbi Lamm's understanding of a movement that we treat as very foreign to us, but which was very much grounded in Rabbi Lamm's model of people as co-creators with God in this universe. Next week, we will discuss Satmar Hasidim. Have a wonderful day.